Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello and welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today we welcome Nick Delaney, Group Chief Commercial Officer at First4Lawyers. Nick is on the podcast to talk about the move of First4Lawyers, which is traditionally better known for personal injury and clin-neg lead generation, into the conveyancing market. This is a really interesting departure for you guys into a new space, Nick. Thanks very much indeed for joining the podcast.
Thanks, David. Good to be here.
First question is always the same. I like to ask a little bit about your background and where you're from. I mentioned classic cars because just before the recording, we were talking about a foray into that market for you at some point in your career. But who are you and what do you do?
So, as you said, Nick Delaney, Group Chief Commercial Officer at First4Lawyers. First4Lawyers is a consumer legal organisation which has been going for 16 years now. I've been with First4Lawyers for just over 8. And before that, I was also with another claims management company within legal services area. So I've been in the industry for about 12, 13 years in total. As a group, we're split into two. We've got an FCA-regulated claims management company that is primarily responsible for lead generation in personal injury, clinical negligence, which we've been doing for, as I said, for 16 years. And then we've also got an ABS-owned law firm, First for Injury Claims, which focuses purely on RTA-related matters. About 18 months ago, we decided we would now take a proper look at how we diversify the business away from those two core areas and start looking at other areas of consumer law that we could get into. And a lot of that kind of sits squarely on my lap.
So go on then, what was the reason behind the departure from, as I say, very well-known brand really and been on national television and that kind of thing? Why is now the right time for First4Lawyers to look at entering the conveyancing market?
I think for us, it was a kind of natural development of the business as we brought on board high-quality chief technology officer that then gave us the ability to develop our software side of the business. It started to open up avenues of expansion and better ways of providing a proposition to both the consumer and the solicitor. So we looked around at the marketplace. You know, we are firmly focused on consumer law. Our ability to bring the consumer through a process and out to a law firm is what we're really, really good at. The consumer side of it is something we are really good at. And so it was a case of, right, how do we now expand the business but do it in a way that's complementary to our skill sets? And we looked at conveyancing, which again is a big pot of potential search volume. You know, it's a big marketplace. Therefore, you look at the big marketplaces and see, how can we get into this? It's a big market. It looks really interesting. Wills and probate was another one we looked at as well, although that throws up more challenges than the conveyancing market in terms of creating a business model that builds traction. So for us, it was a natural extension. We couldn't really do it before because we didn't have the people on board that had those skill sets to get us to the next stage. And now we've got those on board and we've got our own internal development team. It allows us to go after that market in a way that works for us as a business and we hope works well for the consumer and the solicitor.
Really interesting to hear you talk about the challenges of launching in wills and probate. You were saying to me that one of the big challenges there was educating people. It was a long process to educate people on the need for those legal services, whereas conveyancing, transactional in nature, are still very, and we use the word distress purchase in inverted commas, but it's a purchase that people need at a certain point in time, whereas wills and probate, and perhaps even something like family law, is a much slower burn.
Again, I have sat with the head of a probate department who don't have a will because their partner didn't want to talk about it. What is it? 60% of people still don't have a will. It's just one of those things that is something you can put off. Whereas if you're buying a house, you've got to deal with it. It's a more transactional process and therefore a market that you can gain traction in more quickly. Whereas wills and probate, it's just going to take time. I think as the probate market develops and the LPA, certainly the LPA side of the market develops and becomes a more digital process, and there are obviously government consultations going on and plans going on in the background for that to become a purely digital process, that then will probably change the landscape of how you can educate the consumer around the whole wills LPA probate proposition. But it's just not there yet, whereas conveyancing is and has been for a long time.
So First4Lawyers enters into the conveyancing marketplace with F4L Plus, new piece of technology that you, as you say, have developed in-house. First of all, Nick, tell us about what F4L Plus is.
It's effectively a comparison site where a consumer can go on, they've got a conveyancing need, they can search for a quote and a solicitor that suits their needs and then pass their details through to that solicitor to be contacted by the solicitor. It's there to assist the consumer make choices about which law firm they want to use for their conveyancing matter. These consumers are searching digitally. They may well have been presented with the options that their estate agent may put forward to them. They may well have, a mortgage broker that's made recommendations. These are just options the consumers got when they're searching digitally. It's important for us with F4L Plus not to disrupt and change how solicitors' existing routes to market operate. We are just, because of our capabilities from a marketing perspective, and particularly from a digital marketing perspective, we're able to pull consumer inquiries out of the ether, for want of a better word, whereas an individual solicitor wouldn't necessarily be able to do that. But it's not disrupting how they operate with their existing relationships. And as a purely digital platform, we feel it's the most efficient way for us to progress that. The journey for the consumer is purely digital through to the point at which the solicitor picks up the phone and calls them.
An interesting final comment, because the big challenge that conveyancers face at the moment, and consumers, to be fair, is how do we choose the right lawyer? How do we choose the right conveyancing practice? Having used F4L Plus, you'll appreciate, Nick, as a bit of a trial, I spotted that there are a handful of different ways in which you rank your firms on your panel. Can you talk me through the process by which you came about how consumers can make that choice?
Well, firstly, in terms of ranking, the way the solicitors appear will be on a geographical basis. So the closest to the consumer's postcode, that firm will be at the top. Doesn't necessarily mean they're the best choice. It just means that they're the closest. Because again, we'd started off developing this with wills and probate in mind as well, where geography is perhaps more relevant, certainly with family. But on conveyancing, the solicitor also has the option to define what radius they want to operate in terms of accepting leads. But as we found with most of the conveyancers, they want the ability to capture leads that are national. Even though the consumer might get a law firm that's within 10 miles of them, they'll also get quotes from solicitors that are much further afield. And we're finding from talking to solicitors out there and conveyancers out there, they are attracting work from all over the place. It's a transaction that has less geographical necessity, certainly in the modern world, than it used to have. So we're using geography as a ranking method, and then it's down to the consumer to look at the public profile of that law firm, look at the teams. There's the team bios on there, there's sales propositions that the law firms themselves put on there. There's also any rankings and reviews that have been pulled across from the law firm's own Google reviews, Trustpilot reviews, Facebook commentary. We bring all those onto the the public profile of the law firm to try and give the consumer more than just a price to look at. And essentially that's the proposition. That will develop over time and be finessed over time. And as more law firms come onto the platform, that'll give the consumer more choice from a geographical perspective. But yeah, it's still a developing proposition. But at the moment, so far, we've had over 117,000 visits to the platform. We've had just short of 9,000 consumers getting a quote, and that's generated, something like 6,300 leads going out to the law firm so far. So, there is traction building. The consumers are using it, and now it's just about developing it. So the proposition for the solicitor works really well. We can broaden the scope of what we can offer the consumer. It's a constant development.
I want to come on to the qualification process in just a second, Nick, but before I let you get off the topic of ranking, I wonder if there were any lessons that you can bring from personal injury and ClinNeg, which has had its own pricing issues in the past and the race to the bottom, whether you can bring some of those experiences over into this platform to help conveyancers not continue this race to the bottom that we see on fees and pricing.
The challenge there is from our perspective is getting the right firm working with us on the platform. There is a certain kind of split between traditional high street practices that are a department of a multidisciplined firm who have a very traditional approach and very traditional routes to marketplace, to those firms that actually understand that it's a sales proposition, that you need people within that department who can sell, who can get onto the consumer and convert that consumer into a paying customer. There are firms out there that are very, very good at that and have developed their practices and processes to achieve those conversions. They're not necessarily big firms. Some of them are still departments within a multidisciplinary operation, but they've identified that they need somebody within that conveyancing department that can close the deal with the consumer. That translates quite well into what happened in the PI world, and where we see some firms that have had a successful PI department have also taken that approach and put it into the conveyancing department, where you've got some people at the front end that are very good at speaking to the consumer, very good at talking to them in an empathetic way, and then closing the business and getting the letter often signed and the transaction on its way. We found that companies that have had experience to PI and the speed at which the consumer wants a response has translated well into their conveyancing departments. Because again, it's ultimately, it still comes down to the fact that consumers are becoming more demanding in terms of when they get a response and the speed at which that response turns into them making a positive decision. PI kind of lends itself quite well to that. And again, it's educating firms that we are working with that perhaps don't have that background to get them to understand what it would take in order for them to start converting that work better. But we found, we started off working with firms that we had relationships with on PI and ClinNeg. We knew the people involved, and that helped the process. But we know we're going to have to educate some firms as we grow the panel to identify where they need to make improvements on the consumer side of it. There are quite a number of legal tech platforms which are excellent propositions on customer onboarding and speeding up that process. It still requires somebody to convert that client before that kind of engine starts working. And again, where we see ourselves in the grand scheme of things is we're not trying to step on the toes of those legal tech platforms. We're not trying to get involved in how the solicitor manages and conducts that matter. We just bring the work to the table. That's what our focus is. So we're not, a threat from any sense of that. It's just, look, we're just a business that can bring you some work and allow you to incrementally grow the revenue of your department. We just want to make sure that the way you're structured and the way you operate matches what our platform does, So we both have a nice symbiotic relationship and it works. There are some similarities. It's been quite an interesting journey in terms of finding out what works, what doesn't work, but there's no getting around the fact that firms that are good at picking up the phone and speaking to the consumer get more work. Simple as that.
That's fascinating, because you said at the end of one of your answers earlier that you get to a point where it's a digital process until you speak to the customer, and you're a firm believer then that you still have to pick up the phone, you still have to convert those people manually. There's no digital process for that.
I mean, we've got the ability to integrate data with firms now where we could get to a situation where the consumer selects a law firm, they get a quote that arrives by email, there's a call to action button there that says instruct the solicitor. That instruction could drop directly into the solicitor's case management system. But at some point, there has to be human interaction. At some point, the solicitor still has to pick the phone up, speak to the client, because you might think you've captured all the information, but who doesn't want to, at some point, establish a line of communication which is more than just digital with the client? I don't think that will ever go away. I think you can get 95% of the way there, but actually, if you want to establish that client as your client, you've still got to speak to them. I don't think that changes. That might just be my personal opinion, but I think what we've seen is firms that are good at speaking to people on the phone and have an empathetic approach and a sensible, mature way of managing conversations do very well.
Big criticism of platforms like yours, comparison sites, that kind of thing, is the quality of the leads that comes through from it. Now, you're going to sit here on my podcast and say, we're great, we're brilliant, understandably, but it's a fair comment, isn't it? That
no,
there's a qualifications process.
Yeah.
We have, and otherwise, that process that you've just identified there of picking up the phone and speaking to somebody, that could be 99 times out of 100 that doesn't get anywhere, and firms don't have the level of bandwidth or investment to make in that sort of resource.
Yeah, I mean, your qualification process, you're asking the consumer a series of questions and taking them through a series of steps. I mean, the consumer has to set up an account with us, create a password. So there's a definitive step that they've got to take. It's not just a case of them hitting a button and getting a quote without them putting any information in. So there are positive steps that they've got to do in order to obtain those quotes. And we are going to ask them various questions along the line, and we are going to define what the time frame of their need is. So is it immediate? Is it within a month? Is it within 3 months? Are you just researching for the future? We do ask them as well as what is their budget, which is just an information gathering perspective, but it's also kind of what we've had there is some people have no idea what the budget is and therefore haven't got anything to measure their response against. Some people have said, oh, my budget's 250 quid, but then they're going to get a quote that's £800 and it's not affected them. So far in the data that we've run since we began testing this, about 50% of the leads that we've generated are for buying a property. And therefore, we think we've got quite a large proportion of first-time buyers who don't have any historical knowledge of a conveyancer other than what perhaps the parents had used, or they haven't got a family legal connection. And therefore, they're 70% of them are sat on the phones researching digitally. They don't have a natural understanding of what budgets might be. They don't really know what conveyancing is all about. So again, on all your landing pages, you've got to have all the educational information there. So it's just quite an interesting journey that they go on, and it's been quite interesting to watch the data as it comes through to start getting an idea of where they're coming from, what type of transaction they're doing, what the conversion. I mean, in terms of the quality of a lead, the best firms we're working with are converting at over 20% from lead to instruction. There's a relatively decent quality lead going through there, and naturally you can try and refine that process as you go along. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a lead, and no matter how beautifully wrapped with a bow and everything on it the lead is, it still requires the solicitor to convert it.
When the stats that are coming out of the market talk about, I think it's 1 in 3, perhaps 1 in 4 movers are first-time buyers. That certainly seems to stack up against what you've said there, Nick, about the number of leads that you're generating in and around that market. And kind of leads on to a more general point about, I guess, the investment ultimately that you guys have made into this, in that, as you say, this is a completely digital platform. You talked about the volume of searches that are out there for this sort of marketplace. One of the things that a number of firms find very difficult is capturing even a very small percentage of that market share, even within their locality. I mean, things like Google Ads is increasingly prohibitively expensive. Is that something that you've kind of come across as part of this journey?
Yeah, I mean, as a marketing organization, and that's primarily what we are, is the level of expertise that we have on board now lets us manage those challenges on a day-to-day basis. And it is, we have reports running 24/7 because you have to respond to the digital marketplace in real time. And so we'll be spreading pay-per-click adverts across Google and Meta, so Facebook and Instagram. You are constantly monitoring those to make sure that you spend the money in the best way. And part of that understanding of the marketplace is dragged across from the PI and ClinNeg environment, where effectively firms are giving us their budget up front and saying, right, here's my budget for the month. You manage that the best way possible to get me the most work. And so you become effectively a custodian of the law firm's marketing budget. That's not your money, it's their money. So you have to try and manage that money in the most cost-effective way. And to do that, you need talented individuals that understand each of the different marketing sectors. So we'll have digital performance specialists who then will be split into paid social media. We've got, in the PI ClinNeg environment, we still run TV adverts. It's a big constant challenge to be effective and cost effective in that environment, because you can pull a bunch of conveyancing leads and send a raft of cheap raw leads to a law firm, but they might get 20 leads that they've got to sift through, and they might then get constantly bombarded by lead providers. We try and do it as ethically as possible, because we've always had that constant factor that we want to be seen as being an ethical producer of leads, and we always have been. We are very regulated in that we're the CMC side is FCA-regulated, and then we're SRA-regulated on the law firm side. So compliance and doing things properly from a data protection perspective, taking the consumer through the correct journey and the law firm through the correct journey is something we've always done. And that means that on the marketing side, you're constantly kind of sharpening the saw and making sure that you're delivering those leads at the best price you can do. And that takes quite a big team. And we've got a complete internal team that does that. We don't use external agencies. So the software development's done by our own team and the marketing's done by our own team. And that's what gives us, we believe, an edge in the marketplace.
And just to touch very quickly on one of the points you said there about your spend on Facebook and Instagram, and I think I even saw a TikTok account for you guys as well.
Yeah.
There is evidence, presumably, that more and more lead generation is coming through social media.
Law firms are kind of a little bit stuck about what to do with social media at the moment. We produced a white paper in November which focused on social media and how law firms deal with social media, because the investment's quite high to maintain content and to make sure that that content is suitable for the market at that time, because it will change. It's got to be fresh. It's got to be continually updated. And that takes an awful lot of effort. Behind effort is people, and people are budget. And so it is very difficult for individual law firms to build traction in social media unless they are very, very dedicated and there is budget behind it. As a marketing organization, that is it's part of our overall portfolio, and that's where that kind of collective marketing strength comes in. So yeah, it's an interesting field. I mean, conveyancing, yes, there's traction in Facebook and Instagram in terms of generating quality inquiries from the consumer. TikTok we've looked at, but there wasn't as much traction on conveyancing as there is in other legal sectors. So that's one we will revisit, because it's a platform that can't be ignored. I mean, certainly in other areas of the business, TikTok is proving a good social media outlet, but conveyancing less so. But again, it's just having the resource to spend time constantly on that and creating content, engaging with influencers if you need to. How does that relationship work? So yeah, it's not going to go away, but it's difficult for law firms to get it right, and it's difficult for marketing teams within law firms to get that 100% backing they might need from the people at the top to keep spending on it when the return's very difficult to measure.
Social media is a whole other podcast, and we've done a couple historically on social media as well, if listeners want to go back and have a listen to those. But really interesting to hear that take on social and the different platforms and the power of the different platforms for different legal services as well. It's very trial and error, as you say, Nick. It's been great to have you on the podcast. I really, really appreciate you joining. I have one final question, which is really just about where it goes from here. Conveyancing, as you've talked about, is transactional and pretty straightforward. You've talked about some of the issues and challenges with wills and probate as an example. Are there plans to diversify into other areas of the law?
Yeah, I mean, we will go back and look at wills and probate again, but it's a case of getting the model right to suit the gestation period from lead to actual transaction. From a solicitor's perspective, we will look into family law, and we'll probably look into employment as well at a certain point, because again, there's a probably quite a big pool to operate in there. But it's just getting the model right, because not as I'm finding, each individual consumer legal sector works slightly differently. The speed at which different departments operate are obvious, and so you've just got to get that model right to the point where, for a multidisciplinary firm, we can come along with the proposition of, here's the menu, you choose what you want from the menu and what percentage of your marketing budget you want to allocate to that. And that's an important part of the platform as well, is that the conveyancer on the platform, they're in control of their budget, so they can increase or decrease the budget that they commit to the platform how they want. So it's important that they have that control, and if we can extend that control to other areas of legal law, then we can just sit as part of their overall marketing budget with what they want to allocate to it.
It'd be interesting to see how this all plays out over the course of the next 12 months. Perhaps you can come back on the podcast at some point and tell us more about the product as it develops, Nick. But it's been great to have you on. Really, really appreciate you joining and sharing some information about F4L Plus and also sharing some insight into legal marketing as well. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure. And yes, I'll update you in a few months' time and see where we are and whether I've got any more grey hair than I have now. Probably will have.
Well, as the publisher of news outlets that cover 3 very different legal services, I completely empathise with what you said about them all operating slightly differently. The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to Nick. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.